All right. All right, thank you, everyone. We're our final closers here for our 2-day indulgence of decoding communication of non-human species. We were going to end with Tom Denton from DeepMind, and also be accompanied by Laurel Howell talking about Perch and other bioacoustic models they're working on.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really honored to have the chance to speak here. I came last year sort of as a fly on the wall, and it became really clear, like, oh yeah, we've got lots of really interesting things to share, both for y'all to us and maybe even us to y'all. So our group, we've been well, maybe I'll just start here. Yeah, so for 20-odd years or so, it's been pretty reasonable to throw a microphone on the side of a tree and leave it there for a couple of weeks and end up with more audio than you're going to get around to listen to. And more recently, it's been reasonable to throw up hundreds of these microphones and really end up with more audio than you're ever going to get around to listening to. And when you do that, you start collecting this sort of picture, audio picture of what's going on in an ecosystem, possibly over a large amount of range. So our group, we've really been focused on this problem of enabling bioacoustic monitoring at scale to drive conservation impact. So that's kind of where we're coming at things from. So it's a little bit different from the translation understanding side, but some of the same tools I think are actually relevant. This picture on the right here is a layout of the Australian Acoustic Observatory. So they have 360 microphones, and to date have captured over 3 million hours of audio from those microphones over the last 3-4 years. And when you start looking at these really large collections of data, you start wanting to be able to answer this question: how do we efficiently extract useful knowledge from these thousands to millions of hours of audio data? Right? So how do we actually get the stuff out of that is going to help people make these decisions to better protect land, protect species, these sorts of things, restore as well. So we go out, we talk to lots of folks, and usually on this sort of conservation decision-making side, we run into two kinds of questions people are interested in. So one is broad monitoring, where it might be like, hey, yeah, we've got hundreds of mics we're putting out, we've got 200 species of birds, 400 species of birds that we're going to try to count. And we've got so many species we're trying to cover that we really don't have the time or capacity to deal with false positives. So we really want like a high precision system, and then as we sort of get that online, we're going to start slowly building up the recall, and as we get more precise pieces, we're going to bring more species under the umbrella. The other side, which I think is maybe a bit closer to where many of the folks we've heard from so far sit, is individual species monitoring, where you might be really interested in a particular species. Maybe it's endangered, maybe it's invasive, maybe it just makes really cool sounds. And in these cases, we often run into problems where training data is really scarce, and you're so interested that you care a lot about really fine detail. So maybe the sequence and spacing of the sperm whale clicks, or understanding the difference between calls that indicate if a bird is nesting in the area versus just passing through or getting some food, right? Things that really help you understand how the land is being utilized. And for these cases, you really care if it's there or not and how it's utilizing that land. You don't mind burning some of your grad student time throwing away false positives. So you really, really want to find it if it's there. So you really care about recall first, and then you want to bring up precision. And these two sorts of approaches, these are like the exact opposite ends of this trade-off that we have in machine learning. Do you have a lot of precision and let the recall on the floor, or do you go for recall first and leave the precision on the floor? So when we look at bioacoustics, we're really seeing the umbrella is pretty big, right? Like there's a lot of approaches that come in under this. And in our first few years of working on this, after doing some projects, we kind of stepped back and realized that the problem we were running into was that building individual classifiers for one academic group after another really wasn't scaling enough. So it was basically taking 6 months plus to get a classifier together. That's actually kind of optimistic. You have to do data sharing stuff. That's a problem. And then just coordinating between the sort of industry group, using the internal tools to build cool models, and then sharing stuff back to the other group. And lose context, all this, takes a really long time. And it also ends up being really bottlenecked on these machine learning experts, right? So we look at this problem and like where some of the greatest need is, and we're seeing just this problem of just one serial engagement after the next wasn't going to work. So then the question we pose to ourselves is, how do we build a system for coming at this sort of raft of problems where we can efficiently answer new questions as people come to us with them, which haven't been asked before, right? So how do we build something that's really, really general to try to help all of these different situations? So I'll do this a little bit backwards from how I sometimes do it. So this is kind of what we come to when we just sort of look at the passive acoustic analysis workflow in a really abstract way. So you're going to go out, you're going to collect a whole bunch of audio data, you're going to collect a bunch of training data, you're going to train a classifier, you're going to figure out that your classifier's crap, you're going to go back in time and collect more training data and train it again, and eventually you can run inference and you can answer your ecology questions, right? So already you can look at this and think, some of these steps can take you a really long time if you're not smart about it. So if we're training a classifier completely from scratch, we might want thousands of examples, right? When we go and do evaluation, we might run into false positive situations that are really bad and really messing things up, and that costs us a lot of time to go and collect, right? And if we're having to pass stuff back and forth in this step between two different labs, it's bad. So when we look at this, we can sort of draw a yellow box around this stuff in the middle and realize that this is actually like stuff we can automate pretty well. And ultimately, like the more reducible part of this picture is the machine learning expert part. And so if we really, really focus on the bottleneck pieces here, like what's actually holding this back and try to make it run as smooth as possible, then we can try to get these classifiers turned out really, really fast when somebody has a new problem that they're interested in. The basic formula is we start with a robust pre-trained embedding model. And we'll talk a bunch about that in a moment. So that's kind of the beating heart. And once we have that, like a really good embedding model, we're just going to take that and we're going to compute embeddings for your whole data set. So whether it's 100,000 hours or 1,000,000 hours or whatever, you just compute embeddings of everything. Then you show up with whatever it is you're looking for today, and we can use search over those embeddings to very, very quickly get you results back that are the things that look most similar to that thing that you're looking for from the point of view of those embeddings. Some of those will be right, some of them will be not relevant. And you can say yes, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no for those results that come up. And then from those answers that you click on, we can pretty much instantly train a classifier because, hey, we pre-computed all those embeddings, right? They're just sitting there in a database. We can show you a few more results, make sure we're on the right track. And usually after just 1 or 2 rounds of this, we're in a really good place. So you can, and generally what we found is people can sit down with this for anywhere between like a half an hour and 2 hours and have a new classifier for whatever new concept it is that they're interested in. So then ultimately, we've got some Colab notebooks for doing this. Happy to share with whoever. Lauren will talk a little bit more about that at the end. And if all goes according to plan, we make the classifier piece of this really boring. So you can just sort of show up, collect your audio data. That's hard. Use the ML stuff. That's really easy. Only takes me an hour or so. And then really quickly, hopefully, we can start shifting focus to the ecology and conservation questions and spending less time on the ML crap. So we have a paper we put up just recently on this called The Search for Squawk, Agile Modeling in Bioacoustics. We've got case studies, including some coral reef health monitoring and a couple different bird cases, and also explored a lot of best practices too, around like what happens if my species has multiple call types and things like this. So yeah, so I mentioned before that embedding model is really the beating heart of this. And so for the next little bit, I'm just going to talk about that model and sort of the almost weird level of generalization that we're getting out of the bird classifier models. So we find that feature embeddings from our global bird classifiers organize novel data effectively, novel bioacoustic data, I should say. So as sort of a rubber hitting the road test for this, we have this Godwit call type data set. So this is a So remember, this is a global bird species classifier, so it's supposed to predict what species we're looking at, right, in a given 5-second chunk of audio. So Godwit is one species, and so a question you ask is, can we still get call type out of these embeddings, right? So there's 5 different call types in this data set, which is good, because that's how many fingers I have. And this plot, so on the y-axis we have ROC-AUC, so quality, and the x-axis is the number of training examples per class that we gave to the model for training just a linear model for those 5 classes. And what we see is BirdNet and Perch, these 2 bioacoustic bird classifiers, global bird classifiers, they do great. So already well north of 90% ROC-AUC, even with just total of 20 training examples. Okay? So we indeed have not lost the call type information, right? That's still there in that embedding space. And this picture on the bottom, I'm glad somebody else explained t-SNE earlier. So we take all of the data from that Godwit call type data set, project it down to 2 dimensions, color them according to the class. So this is just sort of the pre-existing organization of data in that embedding space. And we see that things are really, really well separated for Perch and BirdNet. If you squint at these, they're actually like, I think like a flip and a rotation from each other almost. It's very, very similar shapes. On the other end, when we look at the CMNet model, which isn't doing so hot, and we look at what's going on in its projected space, we get this sort of muddy mess in the middle, right? And we see that sort of reflected in the quality scores that we're getting out. So the takeaway from this is that the world that you want to live in is one where you show up with a new problem, in this case, Godwit call types, and we wander into this embedding space, and stuff is already sort of well clustered, linearly separable, right? That's the dream, yeah. And it turns out it's apparently a somewhat more achievable dream than we would necessarily expect just at the start of the day. So we said Godwit call type. Yellowhammer dialect is a very fine-grained problem on birds, and I'm going to have another slide on that in a moment, just because I think it'll be of particular interest for this audience. And then bats are not birds, but they're very high pitched, right? So ultrasonics, so I think this data set we had 4 species. And if we frequency shift those, pitch shift those down into the audible range, we can then get embeddings for everything just fine for their click trains. And then we're able to reliably separate the species with very, very little training data. We can work with the Watkins marine mammal data set as well, which I think we heard about yesterday. Oh, standard joke. You'll say we're cheating here because bats fly and therefore they're birds. And of course it works for marine mammals because swimming is just flying underwater. But I would argue that frogs are genuinely not birds, and we seem to be doing okay there. And then this last one was some birds that we just didn't really have much training data for, so showing some good transfer there. So at the end of the day, sort of the lesson is that a good embedding is linearly separable for my problem, whoever I happen to be, right? This slide I usually show to ML students. So I think it's good takeaways to think about how do you get people interested in using your stuff. We can show you lots of benchmark scores, but you're not really going to care until you see it working for your particular problem, right? Or a problem close enough to a problem that you care about. So we really try to design our benchmarks and design our releases around showing that we're working on a really wide range of stuff. And sort of a second takeaway is if you're ultimately interested in finding stuff and maybe trying to count that stuff, right? I think that's actually a pretty good general frame. If you're linearly separable in that embedding space, there's not a whole lot else to do. It's good. You can find it, you can count it. And then once you've done that, once you're linearly separable in that embedding space, we need very little data to build our classifier, and we can run. And I think one of the things really driving this, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, is we were finding a number of the folks working on the project started from this few-shot learning world, and we were finding these papers saying, the best thing you can do for few-shot learning is just make a really hard problem, throw everything in one big bucket, and have sort of an all against all. There was a long time in few-shot learning where people were doing this like train sort of mini tasks and train models that like adapt across mini tasks well. But it turns out just like one macro task where you just throw everything in together kind of wins in a lot of cases. And as we've gone on, we've actually spent like a couple of years trying to get some self-supervised methods to get better embeddings than we get from our supervised model, and it hasn't really worked out. Recently, we were alerted to this paper that was on images, which I think really rhymes with the sorts of results we're seeing, where you can have contrastive models. So these are all different contrastive models. And this black line is a supervised model on the iNaturalist data set, which has 15,000 classes. And what we see is, once you get enough fine-grained supervised data, these contrastive models, they're maybe if we go to like 10 to the 12th data or something, it'll catch up. But this is almost looking like an escape velocity, right? And on the audio side, we're now at a point where we have 1.5 million labeled recordings from Zeno, Canto, and iNaturalist together, right? So there's an enormous amount of labeled data available to us, and that's really helpful. Furthermore, there's just incredible diversity and specificity in birdsong. So incredible diversity. We have 10,000 species covering actually quite a wide range of the audible frequency world. And a lot of specificity as well. So 353 pigeons and doves. So if you're interested in anything like a coo or anything in that sort of frequency range, the models probably had to figure out how to do something with it. I want to make sure there's time for Lauren to talk about whales. So maybe I'll skip over the reasons that birdsong is really cool. And yeah, maybe I'll just talk to this yellowhammer case study just a moment. So this one was the one where, we don't do well right away, but eventually we do. And it was a really subtle problem. So this is yellowhammer dialect. So we've got this first part of the song where there's a bunch of variation in that part of the song that we don't really care about. And in the second part of the song, if it's a low note then a high note, you're on one side of Germany. And if it's a high note then a low note, you're on the other side of Germany, right? So this is sort of there's a sequence learning task in here, right? But there's a bunch of other variation going on that isn't actually what we're looking for. So when you give it very few training examples, it turns out that other variation is kind of swamping that piece that we care about. But the information was actually still there. And if you sort of train the classifier and then look at which direction that hyperplane is pointing, right, that separating hyperplane, turns out it was about the same as the fifth PCA component of the embedding data. So you have to sort of give it enough data to work its way down to that level of detail, but it was still able to do it. And then this embedding space, you can see things are still clustered, but not quite as obvious how you're going to pull that out. Recently, a few groups have been doing really interesting work on individual bird ID. So probably there's a lot of reasons for some species to think that this should be very, very doable. It is sort of a sequence learning problem. And one of the hardest parts of it is really just ground truthing it. So how do you know that you're actually identifying different individual birds who are flying around and things like this? The Kitsis lab has been doing really, really great work with localization using microphone arrays to be able to provide really good ground truth for this. And they were able to recover song sparrow repertoire. So you get these sort of clusters of 5 different songs that are associated with an individual. And then those are all sort of showing up as their own blobs in that embedding space. So you can actually do really, really fine-grained stuff with this. This other study I actually just saw a couple days ago, looking at 5 different species in Australia. And both BirdNet and Perch are doing really good. Oh yeah, and then I was just going to show you, so here's a bunch of white-crowned sparrow songs. They tend to have this sort of initial species identifier, this long note at the beginning, but then you see these dialect variations over geography. And in whitehorse, you can see there's some similarity between these individual singing, but there is some individual variation as well. So there's a lot to pull out here. With that, I'll skip the poetry and hand it off to Lauren to talk about whales.
Yeah? Yeah, I got a microphone. All right, so it's great that we have tons and tons of classes for birds. We really don't actually have that kind of luxury with whales, or at least on the species level. So we've actually been working in Google Research on bioacoustics for whale vocalizations for almost 8 years now, where our colleagues from NOAA reached out. Ann Allen from the Pacific Islands Fishery Center asked us to look at 15 years worth of audio data and find all of the humpback whales. Now, humpbacks have extraordinarily diverse songs in their own right, and this is still focused primarily on the Northern Hemisphere Pacific population at the time. She had annotated about 3 weeks worth of that 15 years of data, but making it kind of concrete with what Tom was talking about, to build that initial classifier, it was orders of magnitudes of weeks to months of back and forth on that active learning process of we'd train a version, we'd make a supercut, we'd send it back to Anne, she would annotate, send it back to us, we have to process those labels. Yeah, it takes a while. And we did the same thing when we built our multi-species model that was just released last year, that came out with this paper on the Brutus whale biotwang, which is a really fun mystery noise that we'll talk about later. But in addition to that, we also have other different challenges in the marine bioacoustic space that might be familiar to many folks here. You have a diversity of sensors with the hydrophones and the dive housings, and the acoustic conditions are very different. We also have different frequency ranges from birds, where we might have some very low vocalizations that would normally get tossed out by a high-pass filter, or you might have some very high frequency sounds in the echolocation space. We do have also very different soundscapes. We also have this depth effect of that changes how the sound propagates underwater. Also temperature, salinity, and other things do affect that as well. And then it is also harder to ground truth because we don't have as many visual observers who say, oh, there's the bird, it's singing right there. And so it's easier to get that species identification. And finally, give or take approximately 94 species of cetaceans, depending on how you're classifying a species, versus 10 to 11K bird species. So we don't have that luxury of having all of those classes. So, can we actually use the models that are trained on birds to study whale vocalizations better, given that they have a lot of efficiency gains, and using that process would be really, really helpful for us to study whales? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. And by the way, this is not AI, it's just me copying and pasting a tanager over the belugas. Starting with a case study, if you're going to pick, okay, which species of whales would be the most maybe likely to transfer, how about we pick the canary of the sea, the beluga? So they have a very diverse set of vocalizations, which also might include individual names. They have a lot of social vocalizations as well. I had about 50 hours of unlabeled audio from Somerset Island in 74° north in high Canadian Arctic on this beluga population. Some of it's a cacophony of beluga soup. I will quickly play some audio because hopefully this goes. And it does not. OK, cool. Oh. All right, so those are our belugas. And so we use the agile modeling process kind of referenced in that paper. You embed all of the audio data you want into a database. It's now a lot more efficient to search. Then, so if you have a really high quality embedding model that Tom was talking about, you're able to have that linear separation, which is nice. So then you search for a query audio. And then you go through of the search results and say, OK, yes, no. And then you iterate and create a classifier based off of that. So you go completely from unlabeled audio to a classifier. And again, I did this in about under 2 hours from, embedding the data to getting it a fully trained classifier with sufficient model performance. Notice in my embedding space, there's a little bit of overlap here because there are some sounds that I was actually a little bit uncertain about myself. And so some of that is my human element in there that if I had to find a separation, I would be a little bit worried about that model. But then I was also including in that 2 hours, I was able to get the call density estimate around my 50 hours of audio as well. So this is just a quick case study of, turns out, yes, it works great for belugas, but it also works great for Brutus whales, which are much lower frequency. So this is my query audio here. So that's the biotwang, the low frequency mode. In case people are hard of hearing, didn't hear that well. Yes, we love imitating whale calls here. So that's my query. And I have an example notebook. So this is on our Perch repository that's using the NOAA Passive Acoustic Archive data. There's all of that 20 years of audio that I mentioned earlier and more, all on the Google Cloud public hosted data sets. This is just embedded an example that goes through one big audio file that's about 10 hours of it where I know that there's those biotwangs, and then it shows how to search. And then you go through those search results and you say, oh, yes, this is a biotwang, this isn't. If you don't know, you just leave it blank. Then you train a simple classifier, and then you can apply that model to label all the data, and then you can get your output out in a CSV. It's all a very quick, efficient process designed to be easy to run and use. So. Also, one more shameless plug. There is an AI for non-animal communication workshop happening at NeurIPS this year. It'll be on December 6th. The call for papers is coming soon. Expect 4-page papers that will be due August 31st. I'll send more details out afterwards, but the call for papers is coming very soon, but it's not out yet. I just want to make everyone aware that all of the research that we've heard about here would be very, very, very relevant to the NeurIPS workshop. So if you're looking for a venue for your papers, check it out.
2026 or 2025?
Oh, 2025. Whoops. Thank you. Yes, that is this year, and the deadline is in exactly a month. So on that. Questions for us? Sorry, I went over time.
Oh, it's supposed to be that slide.
Oh, well, there's supposed to be a bird there. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
For the whale vocalizations, are you rescaling the time base, frequency base to overlap with the bird spectrum, or?
So for the baleen species that particularly like the blue and fin whales, that would be recommended because most of the embedding spaces don't really have a whole lot of features at low frequency space. With that said, the embedding space that I use in the demo notebook, so there's a few different models. I'm using the surf perch model, which is trained on both birds and coral reef data, but not specifically whale data. It's just there's some underwater audio in there. Those work really well. I am not actually adjusting anything about the audio other than resampling it so that way it can be embedded with the same model. The NOAA data that I'm using for that was recorded at, I think, 10 kilohertz. And so then it has to just be resampled to 32 for that, but I'm not actually doing any sort of pitch shifting.
I'm tired of having a voice. Great talk, very nice. I just had a question about the one of the first embedding spaces, the TSNE that I think Tom showed at the beginning. So I noticed that the true labels of the colors were, well separating all the categories, but then you kind of had some subclusters like within the same color. Does that correspond to any biological category, something that you've noticed in the acoustic space?
Check. I don't know if this is on. So that's a great question. It claims to be on. I don't know. So clusters are funny, and when you start really thinking about clusters, there's a few things that can go on. So one is, you might have multiple sounds, and so you'll get clusters that are like, oh, common thing A and common thing B actually make a whole other cluster over here. Sometimes you do have some disagreement between, here's what the humans thought makes a good cluster, and here's what and you see this a lot with like how many call types are there. Like researcher A will say there's 2, and researcher B will say there's 27. So yeah.
Clustering is dangerous.
Yeah.
TSNE also loves to see clusters that you can feed in unclustered data, and TSNE will
find clusters.
will just find clusters.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, if you could use it for category discovery. Like this is something that I'm trying to do with dolphins. So.
Yeah, totally. So I've been thinking on a back burner for a while about like independent component discovery.
Right.
So like, hey, even though we're clustering the data, we should be able to like find these sort of explanatory directions. And that rhymes really closely with classification as well. So like, how do we find the classifier planes that like best describe the data?
Cool, thank you.
This is very exciting for me because I actually work with humpback whales. So my question is, based on your experience of applying this model now to whales, this trained bird model to whales, what do you think we would need to do in order to get towards the like high complexity humpback whale acoustics and sort of clustering those?
Yeah, I mean, some of the reasons that notebook exists is for the next phases of work with NOAA, where there's several of the NOAA researchers that we've talked with are really interested in, looking at now particular song components and call types and classifying those, right? And like our original humpback model was just at a species level. We also got a lot of feedback from folks like in Australia saying, okay, well, this doesn't work for my population. It's like, well, because it's not classifying this sound right, or it's having a false positive on these noises in our conditions over here. And so that's where, having a really good embedding model, then in a process that's fairly efficient, that doesn't require a whole lot of label data, then you can fine tune a model. And so we do have the ability to load in our existing humpback model or the multi-species whale model that we put out into that process. So you can actually put a drop down and like pick which model. I find that surf perch has been working pretty well because of that diversity of classes for those different components. And so then another option would be, doing that kind of search for a different query sound, clustering on the embedding. So once you have really good embeddings, then if you start clustering the sounds, or looking at token distributions, for instance, if you have a tokenizer that you want to try to apply. So there's a few different options there, but that is the next phase, is trying to look at the different complexities and the pieces of humpback sound. Now, these are all kind of working on these fixed window spectrograms. Another component then is like, where speech models have those kind of more sequence-based information, but they're trained on human data and not, these specific features of bioacoustics. So there's opportunity there for, I think, to try to blend concepts together that way as well. But, yeah.
Well, and they're doing very different things in different places, so that just makes that more difficult.
Yes. And so that part of it is you still do need, maybe one key point that we didn't explicitly say here, this really does depend on the experts, right? What we're trying to do is scale the expert brains who actually have been looking at the spectrograms, who know what they're looking for, and but being able to also make discoveries at scale too. Like, okay, I see this sound, I know what this is, I now search for more of that and see similar sounds, but oh wait, that's a new sound. And then if I can just search my data set for how often is that new sound now in my thousands of hours recording, right? And then I can get a sense of how often that occurs. Well, what other sound pieces are in similar time frames as that one? You can start then really easily querying your data through the embedding space to make those discoveries. But yes, this is all in the passive acoustic space, where if this is assuming we don't have any video data, or we have very little human annotation, and so it does require the expert review, but how do we scale that a lot easier? But then in this world where we have connections to video data and we have better ground truth labels, then we can also scale that up a little bit easier to apply. Okay, how can we, we have good embedding models for the audio, so now how do we bring in the complexity from the other things? And yeah.
Very exciting.
Yes.
Hi, this is super cool. A two-part question, I guess. So I think it was the Yellowhammer where you were saying that it needed to cue in on the sort of what was in the fifth PCA or whatever. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because one of the things with the sperm whales is we're finding increasingly sort of sub-variants. So there's like a class, and then there's a variant of it, and then there's two variants within each of those variants. And so, queuing it on the third part down the hierarchy actually might make the classification faster. So can you talk about, because it sounded like you just said you just need more and more and more data so that because when you cut it down by female and male and by this clan and then this family, then the sample sizes get smaller and smaller and smaller. So what did you mean by?
Yeah, so for that data, so I'll maybe just point to the picture again. So PCA, you're looking at like decomposing variation, right? So we've got an embedding for each of our clips. We've got this many thousand clips. You can just make a big matrix of that and then do PCA on it, right? And then you've got PCA components for your directions. We know that there's variation in here that isn't what we're interested in. So you've got your background sounds. We've got all of this other sequence stuff going on that's varying independent of that dialect piece that we're looking for.
Right.
And this fifth PCA component piece, that's the classifier hyperplane happens to align well with that PCA component, which says, hey, that is an axis of variation for that data, right? You just got to like get past all of those other sources of variation in order to find it.
Yeah, so I think that's the part I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
So like if it's 2% or something of the total variation in the sound. So how are you focusing it in on that, I guess is the question.
So this is the more data piece, right? So when we have, this is a 2-class problem, right? So this is training on 8 data points. And when you just pick 8 random data points, you're going to have some spurious correlations. You have all of these other variations going on. And so finding that 2% variation, it's kind of a chance whether you get it or not. But I think there's maybe another kind of question here. So like, what happens if this embedding space doesn't contain as fine a variation as you're actually interested in? So if we are like getting to a place where it was like the muddy mess in the middle for YAMNet, that could be. It could be that embedding space doesn't contain that level of variation that you're looking for, and like it just hasn't gotten there yet. And what I would say in this case is the system we have is actually still a really, really good starting point relative to starting from nothing. So you can still like focus in on that stuff that you're really interested in, and then do further analysis, maybe build some like specific classifier for that subset of data. And you're going to get to what you're after much faster than you would if you were just like, oh yeah, let me like listen to 5,000 hours of audio and find like the 4 examples of what we're looking for.
And maybe to rephrase a little bit, like the classifiers that we're saying are really simple. Like it's effectively just a logistic regression on the embedding space, right? So you could build a slightly deeper neural network on the learned embedding space that's now like, okay, a little bit more fine-tuning, deep learning needed rather than just like a logistic regression.
Or do LoRa training, this sort of thing. Like, I think most of the folks we work with, like LoRa is like well beyond what we would expect people to want to get into. But maybe for this crowd, that would be a really appropriate thing to do.
All right, guys, so we're 15 minutes over time,
Okay,
but we'll stop here and then you guys can ask more questions. But thank you very, very much.
Sure.
So, all right, we made it through two days of intense. I just want to thank all the presenters for so much sharing and information, and just to this broader community for all these folks here that are interested in wanting to know what more than humans are talking about and how to interpret them. I feel like in the last 5 years since we've been doing this, the field is really starting to mature. We're just saying, and now that there's a NeurIPS session, it's really, so it's really heartening to see this community grow. And I'm really excited to see where this is going. So excited to everyone to just keep in touch and hope there'll be new collaborations and discourse from this. And a special thanks to the Shafi for...
We're going to thank the Simons Foundation.
And the Simons Foundation.
And the Simons Institute and Omid in the video. I want to thank Omid in the video room and Frances who helped also yesterday. She worked all day on the party. And Ashley. So they're not here, but I hope that they will look at the recording and see that we're very grateful to them.
Yeah.
And to David.
No. All right, thank you, everyone. I don't know if we have formal drinks, but I think on the agenda it's like people should go out for drinks or something. Informal, yeah.